Hi, this is Eternal King here, bringing you another LOR video today. So I want to talk a little bit about beating meta decks. So Eternal, unlike Standard, does not have best decks in a format. It has a series of good decks that can be very easily countered with matchup knowledge. So I'll give you an example. Ryze is one deck that I struggle with quite a bit on occasion in Eternal. And the reason for that is because I'm a naturally slow player. So what Ryze does is he is very, very good at denying value when you have the attack token, and then, of course, presenting or playing Solitaire when you don't have the attack token. And that's the way this deck functions. So if you're playing a mid-range deck, any sort of slower combo deck, really any slower deck at all, you could almost auto-concede into the Ryze matchup. What this deck does really poorly into is the aggro matchup most of the time. And what it does impossibly poorly into is rally matchups. So in that instance, when you understand that, okay, this is a meta deck that I am struggling with, the solution isn't to, move to the forums and complain about, a certain card or deck being overpowered. The solution is matchup based. And that's just the way Eternal is as a format. If you don't like that, again, that's what makes it different. In Standard, pro players can grind a top percentage deck and essentially have no counter or thing that they need to worry about in a tournament lineup. In Eternal, every single meta deck is counterable. If Majin Bey piloted Ryze in a Eternal tournament and someone else was playing Azir Irelia, he would lose. There's just no way that he would win that. Azir Irelia, okay, so that brings us to Azir Irelia. This is the natural counter for Ryze, but again, it's not the only counter. Any rally shell or shell that can present multiple attacks is bad for Ryze. You could be running the rally card in Lurk. You could be running the rally card in Zed Hecarim. You could be playing Scouts. You could be playing Poppy, Tarek Poppy in a rally shell. Like, all of those things are really, really bad for Ryze. But again, we'll go with the most obvious solution, which is Azir Irelia. So again, I was doing a best of 3 with an opponent on Eternal Ladder. And I just instantly wiped all 3 games with Azir Irelia because, again, there's just nothing he could have done from a piloting perspective on Ryze. And again, he was, a fine Ryze player. There's nothing he could have done to win those games. And so, and again, every now and then I will whip out meta decks in Eternal, not because I like them, but because I'm teaching a valuable lesson. And that lesson is that if you can't play into meta decks, if you can't win meta deck matchups, you are not a Masters level Eternal player, and you never will be. It's simply something that you have to get used to. If you were playing Eternal on ladder, you will run into Azir Irelia, you will run into Ziggs Poppy, you will run into Ryze. All of these decks you need to understand the matchups, and if the play rate is too high to deal with, then potentially switching decks to something that's going to perform better. Talking about the construction of Azir Irelia, I prefer the 3 Defiant Dance version, but the one that's on Mastering Runeterra is a little more one-drop spammy. So again, depending on, you have to be kind of okay into either version. Either the opponent's going to be on 3 sparring students and be very one-drop aggro heavy. I like the Defiant Dance version personally. It's a little more reactive, gives the deck a little more substance most of the time. Now, Defiant Dance isn't a perfect card. There are some things that you actually don't want to bounce because it actually gives the opponent value. But those decks are few and far between. For the most part, Defiant Dance is going to be very strong. It'll be an MVP card in most matchups. So again, this is very good. So yeah, very straightforward deck. Desert's Wrath was kind of the new addition. This card got buffed, and it just allows you to go off harder with your tribal. And 99% of the time, the way that I play it is I line up the tribal synergies, right? I line up the Emperor's Diocese. I line up the big Desert's Wrath. I line up the Azir. I line up the Domination. I play it very slow. And then you can start blade dancing with Irelia. And it doesn't really matter if Irelia levels very quickly or not. And that's the way that I play it, and I find that very effective. Moving on to the next meta deck. So, what is the counter for Azir Irelia? We talked, Azir Irelia counters Ryze. What beats Azir Irelia? You can play Elusives. Elusive Spam does exceptionally well into Azir Irelia. And the reason for that is you can Mystic Shot very easily. Really, any deck that runs Mystic Shot is going to do pretty well into Azir Irelia. This is the best counter because it just kills Irelia on curve. But other things that this deck has going for it is that you can present big Sparkle Flies, which are very problematic on the block. Winged Messenger is very problematic on the block. Stuff like that. It's mainly the 3-drop slots here that are very problematic for Azir Irelia. And so if they are not on the Defiant Dance version like I am, which they should be, they'll have an even harder time. They'll basically auto-concede into this because they have no way to bounce your board. Because the Mastering Runeterra version runs 0 bounces. So that's a good counter. But again, there are other counters as well. Ziggs Poppy will have a pretty good matchup into Azir Irelia a lot of the time. Because all it has to do is, present a wide enough board with like House Spider and Imperial Demolitionist and just continue to chip away at the opponent's life total. And because they only run one counter spell, and there's a very good chance that you will out-aggro them faster than they can set up their kind of tribal synergies most of the time. But that's more of like a 50-50 scenario. What beats Ziggs Poppy? Another one of the top meta decks. Well, Ziggs Poppy is really easy to beat. All you have to do is play a bunch of junk to chump, and you will beat this deck 90% of the time. It doesn't have much else going for it other than going wide and then swinging with a Poppy and swinging with Ziggs, which are slightly overstated for what they do. It's really all the deck has going for it, so you can literally just play a bunch of junk and beat this deck. It's not hard. So again, this isn't standard, right? All these decks are highly counterable. And those are kind of the big three, is like the big polar opposites. You have the big aggro deck, the big rally deck, and then the big combo deck, which is Ryze. And those are kind of your 3 points on the spectrum. A couple other things to be wary of, ramp. But again, what beats ramp? Well, it's going to be Ziggs Poppy is going to have an exceptionally good matchup into ramp. As long as you understand how to play around Avalanche, which you should by now. So, again, those are the 4 points. You have, your ramp, you have your combo deck, you have your aggro deck, and you have your rally deck. Those are the big 4 points. Then understanding how to beat those points is really going to define whether or not you're a competitive Eternal player or whether you are going to be forever stuck in Standard. So this is Eternal King signing out. Don't be afraid of meta decks in Eternal. Because you should be afraid of meta decks in Standard, because usually there's literally no available counter for them. But in Eternal, it's far more liquid. If you hit the Ryze, then play the Rally deck. If you hit the aggro deck, then play a mid-range deck with a bunch of chumping bodies, play a bunch of junk creatures. If you are into the Azir Irelia, well, maybe you want to, there's a lot of solutions into Azir Irelia. Azir Irelia is one of the more fragile decks in the game. But it is so good specifically into combo matchups and OTK decks and things like that. It's so good into that it just has a massive win rate. And also just a lot of people struggle into this deck. A lot of people will tell you that Azir Irelia is the best deck in the game in Eternal. It really isn't. But the number of people that struggle into this deck is surprising. Because all it does is like hard commit to very straightforward lines of play, and if you can't deal with that, like if you don't know how to snap Mystic Shot in Irelia by now, that's going to be a problem for you. Again, if you don't know how to deny Blade Dance value through proper blocking, you're going to have a lot of problem with this deck. Now, of course, piloting makes a big difference, right? I can pilot Azir Irelia slightly better than the average player, even though this isn't like one of my favorite decks. But I bring it out every now and then just to remind people not to be too greedy with their deck construction. But yeah, it is a very fragile deck. Like I said, the meta version doesn't even run Defiant Dance. If you look, there's literally 0 bounces in this deck. There's only self bounces. And so if the opponent's on this, specifically the version with 0 interaction for Mastering Runeterra, like this is so fragile. And there's just like nothing that this deck can deal with sometimes in terms of just like I said, a big lifesteal unit. You just present a big lifesteal unit and now you just block everything. And there's just nothing that the meta version of this deck can deal with. So yeah, again, don't be afraid of meta decks in Eternal. That's the great thing about this format. The only thing that you need to do to deal with a meta deck in Eternal is to properly evaluate the matchup and make adjustments. This is Eternal King signing out.